Explore Poirot's Casebook Audio, where Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot cracks cases in immersive audio stories. In the shadowed halls of Blackthorn Manor, a gunshot shatters the autumn night. Rupert Langley lies dead by the boathouse, a revolver in the mud, a cufflink gleaming with his initials. Was it suicide, or a cunning murder disguised as despair? Enter Hercule Poirot, the brilliant Belgian detective whose little gray cells unravel a web of secrets, debts, betrayal, and a hidden love that turned deadly. Who among the elegant guests hides a killer's heart? Why was a garden shovel used to cover tracks? And what did the half-burned letter conceal? Dive into this classic Agatha Christie-style mystery where every clue counts and the truth waits in the shadows. Will you guess the killer before Poirot's shocking reveal? Chapter 1. The Gathering at Blackthorn Manor. In the gentle haze of an English autumn, Blackthorn Manor stood resolute against the encroaching dusk, its ivy-clad walls glowing faintly under the amber light of October. Nestled in the rolling hills of Kent, the estate was a monument to old wealth, its gabled roofs and mullioned windows whispering of a grandeur that had weathered time. Tonight, however, the air within its oak-paneled halls carried a subtle undercurrent of unease, as though the house itself sensed the gathering storm. Captain Arthur Hastings, ever the loyal companion of Hercule Poirot, stepped from the chauffeured car onto the gravel drive, his polished shoes crunching softly. He adjusted his scarf against the evening chill, his eyes tracing the silhouette of the manor. "A fine place, this," he murmured to himself, though his soldier's instinct prickled at the stillness. The invitation to Blackthorn Manor had come unexpectedly, penned in the elegant hand of Lady Beatrice Langley, the matriarch of the Langley family, requesting his presence for a weekend of delightful company and stimulating conversation. Poirot, to Hastings' surprise, had declined to attend, citing a pressing engagement in London, but had urged Hastings to go in his stead, with a cryptic smile and a promise to join later if needed. "Observe, mon ami," Poirot had said, tapping his temple, "and report to me all that you see with those honest eyes of yours." The heavy oak door swung open, revealing a butler whose impeccable posture and somber expression seemed carved from the manor itself. "Captain Hastings, sir," he intoned, bowing slightly. "Lady Langley awaits you in the drawing-room." Hastings followed the butler through a labyrinth of corridors adorned with ancestral portraits, their eyes seeming to follow him with silent judgment. The air was thick, velvet armchair. Her emerald gown shimmered as she extended a gloved hand.
"Captain Hastings, how charming of you to join us,"
she said, her voice warm, yet laced with an authority that brooked no dissent.
"I trust your journey was pleasant?"
"Quite, thank you," Hastings replied, shaking her hand. His gaze swept the room, cataloguing the assembled company with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to Poirot's methods. There were 8 in total, a constellation of personalities orbiting Lady Langley's commanding presence. To her left stood her nephew, Rupert Langley, a lanky man in his 30s with sharp features and a restless energy. His tailored suit was impeccable, but his fingers toyed incessantly with a silver cigarette case, betraying a nervous disposition. Beside him was his wife, Clara, a striking brunette, whose porcelain skin and violet eyes drew every glance. Her smile was polite but guarded, as though she were playing a role she had not yet mastered. Across the room, Dr. Malcolm Everett, a retired physician with a shock of white hair and a kindly demeanor, sipped sherry and nodded amiably. His niece, Evelyn Carter, a young woman with a cascade of auburn curls and a quick laugh, stood at his side, her eyes darting curiously about the room. She wore a modern dress of soft blue, its hem daringly above the ankle, marking her as a woman of independent spirit. Then there was Mr. Gerald Warwick, a solicitor of middle age, whose round spectacles and pinched expression suggested a life spent poring over ledgers. His wife, Margaret, hovered near him, her plain features softened by a nervous smile. She clutched a lace handkerchief, twisting it absently as she listened to the conversation. Finally, at the edge of the group, stood Miss Diana Finch, Lady Langley's companion, a woman of indeterminate age, whose mousy brown hair and dowdy attire did little to conceal the sharpness in her gray eyes. She moved with the quiet efficiency of one accustomed to being overlooked, yet Hastings sensed a keen intelligence in her fleeting glances. The last guest, Colonel Reginald Blake, a retired military man with a bristling mustache and a booming voice, was recounting a tale of his days in India.
And there I was, face to face with a tiger. Nothing but a rifle and my wits,
he declared, eliciting a polite chuckle from Evelyn and a strained smile from Clara. Rupert, seated across from Hastings, spoke little, his eyes fixed on his plate as though it held the answers to some unspoken question. Clara, beside him, deflected inquiries about their recent travels with vague pleasantries. Dr. Everett, meanwhile, seemed preoccupied, his fork pausing mid-air as he stared into the distance. Evelyn, ever vivacious, attempted to lighten the mood with a story about a misadventure in London, but even her laughter felt forced. As the dessert course, poached pears in brandy sauce, was served, Lady Langley tapped her glass, drawing all eyes to her. "My friends," she began, her tone measured, "I have invited you here not merely for pleasure, but for a purpose. Tomorrow evening, I intend to make an announcement regarding the future of Blackthorn Manor and my estate. It is a matter of some delicacy, and I trust you will all be present." A murmur rippled through the room. Rupert's cigarette case clicked open and shut. Clara's hand tightened on her wineglass. Gerald Warwick's spectacles glinted as he leaned forward, and Margaret's handkerchief twisted into a knot. Even Colonel Blake's joviality faltered, his mustache twitching as he exchanged a glance with Dr. Everett. Hastings, attuned to the undercurrents, noted every detail, the flicker of unease in Evelyn's eyes, the way Miss Finch's lips pressed into a thin line, the sudden stillness of the room. He wished Poirot were here, with his knack for seeing through facades to the truth beneath. What was Lady Langley's announcement? And why did it seem to unsettle her guests so profoundly? As the party dispersed to the drawing room for coffee, Hastings lingered, pretending to admire a portrait of a stern-faced Langley ancestor. His mind raced, cataloging the evening's observations. The tension was palpable, a coiled spring waiting to snap. He could almost hear Poirot's voice. "Mon ami, it is in the small things, the glance, the gesture, the word unspoken, that the truth lies hidden." Outside, the wind rose, rattling the windows and sending a chill through the manor. Hastings glanced at his watch. 9:47 p.m. The night was young, but already he sensed that Blackthorn Manor was a stage set for tragedy. He resolved to write to Poirot in the morning, urging him to come. For now, he would watch and listen as his friend guarded expression and Lady Langley's cryptic announcement replaying like a film reel. The air in the manor felt heavier today, as though the walls themselves held their breath, awaiting the inevitable. Breakfast was a subdued affair. The long table, set with crisp linens and gleaming silver, bore an array of dishes: kippers, kedgeree, toast with marmalade, but the guests picked at their plates with little enthusiasm. Lady Beatrice Langley, resplendent in a dove-gray morning dress, presided with her usual poise, though her sharp eyes missed nothing. Hastings noted the absence of Rupert Langley, whose empty chair drew curious glances from the others. Clara, his wife, offered a brittle smile when asked about him. "Rupert had a restless night," she said, her voice light but strained. "He's taking a walk in the gardens to clear his head." Dr. Malcolm Everett, seated opposite Hastings, buttered his toast with deliberate care, his movements slow and thoughtful. "A fine morning for a walk," he remarked, though his tone suggested his mind was elsewhere. His niece, Evelyn Carter, chatted animatedly about the manor's rose garden, her auburn curls bouncing as she gestured, but her eyes flicked nervously towards the door. Gerald Warwick, the solicitor, murmured agreement, his spectacles glinting as he scanned the morning's newspaper. His wife, Margaret, sat silently, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her handkerchief nowhere in sight, a detail Hastings found oddly significant. Colonel Reginald Blake, ever the hearty presence, recounted a tale of a dawn hunt in the Punjab, but his booming voice lacked its usual vigor. Miss Diana Finch, Lady Langley's companion, sipped her tea in silence, her gray eyes darting between the guests as though cataloging their every word. Hastings, trained by Poirot to observe the smallest details, noted the way her fingers tightened around her cup when Clara mentioned Rupert's absence. The clock on the mantel struck 9, its chimes sharp in the quiet room. Lady Langley rose, smoothing her dress. "I trust you will all join me for a tour of the estate this morning," she said, her tone leaving no room for refusal. "The gardens are particularly lovely this time of year, and I have some matters to discuss before tonight's announcement." As the group dispersed to prepare, Hastings lingered, his gaze settling on a small silver tray near the sideboard. It held a collection of letters, one of which bore a smudged postmark and a name he couldn't quite make out. Nodded and moved on. He couldn't shake the feeling that she, like the others, was playing a part in some unseen drama. The garden tour was a study in contrast. Lady Langley led the way, pointing out rare orchids and ancient oaks with the pride of a curator, while the guests trailed behind, their conversations stilted. Evelyn walked arm in arm with Dr. Everett, her laughter bright but forced. Colonel Blake strode with military precision, his cane tapping the gravel path, while Gerald and Margaret Warwick kept to themselves, whispering in low tones. Clara, alone, seemed distracted, her eyes scanning the horizon as though searching for her absent husband. It was nearly 11 when the scream shattered the morning's calm. It came from the direction of the old boathouse, a weathered structure by the lake at the edge of the estate. Hastings' heart leaped, his soldier's instincts kicking in as he broke into a run, the others close behind. The scream had been unmistakably female. Clara's, he realized, her voice raw with terror. They found her by the boathouse door, her hands pressed to her mouth, her violet eyes wide with horror. At her feet lay Rupert Langley, his body sprawled across the damp grass, a dark stain spreading across his white shirt. A single gunshot wound marred his chest, and his lifeless eyes stared skyward, unseeing. A revolver lay a few feet away, half buried in the mud, its barrel glinting dully in the sunlight. "Rupert!" Clara gasped, collapsing to her knees. Dr. Everett knelt beside her, checking for a pulse, though the grim set of his jaw told Hastings all he needed to know. The doctor shook his head. "He's gone," he said quietly. Lady Langley stood frozen, her face pale but composed. "This is a tragedy," she said, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "We must send for the police at once." Colonel Blake, his face flushed with outrage, gestured toward the revolver. "Looks like a clear case to me. Poor chap must have taken his own life. Debt, perhaps, or some private despair." Hastings frowned, his mind racing. The scene felt wrong, staged somehow, though he couldn't yet pinpoint why. The revolver's position, the angle of Rupert's body, the absence of any note, it all seemed too neat, too convenient. He wished desperately for Poirot's presence, his friend's uncanny ability to see through the fog of deception. The local constable, a burly man named Inspector Hargrove, arrived within the hour, accompanied by a young sergeant who began cordoning off the scene. Hargrove.
"The party this morning?" "I was," Hastings replied, choosing his words carefully. "Rupert was absent at breakfast, and Clara mentioned he was walking in the gardens. We heard the scream around 11. Hargrove nodded, scribbling furiously. "Looks like suicide, but we'll need to confirm. The coroner will examine the body and will test the revolver for prints." He glanced at the group, his eyes narrowing. "Anyone know why Mr. Langley might have been distressed?" A heavy silence followed. Evelyn bit her lip, glancing at Dr. Everett, who stared at the ground. Gerald Warwick adjusted his spectacles, avoiding the inspector's gaze, while Margaret clutched her husband's arm. Miss Finch stood apart, her expression unreadable, though Hastings caught the faintest tightening of her jaw. Lady Langley stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension. "My nephew was a troubled man, Inspector, but I cannot believe he would take his own life. He had plans, ambitions. I urge you to investigate thoroughly." Hargrove grunted, clearly skeptical. "We'll do our duty, my lady. For now, I ask that no one leave the manor until we've completed our inquiries." As the group dispersed, Hastings lingered by the boathouse, his eyes scanning the scene. The revolver, he noted, was a Webley, standard issue for officers, a detail Colonel Blake might appreciate given his military background. The mud around it was undisturbed, save for a single set of footprints leading to the lake's edge and back. He crouched, examining the ground, and spotted a small glinting object half buried in the grass. A cufflink, engraved with the initials R.L. Rupert's, undoubtedly, but its placement seemed odd, too prominent to have been dropped by accident. Hastings straightened, his mind buzzing with questions. Why had Rupert come to the boathouse alone? What had driven him to such a desolate spot? And why did Clara's grief, raw as it seemed, feel somehow rehearsed? He resolved to telephone Poirot at once, certain that his friend's little gray cells were needed now more than ever. As he walked back to the manor, the wind carried the distant toll of the village church bell, marking noon. The shadow of death had fallen over Blackthorn Manor, and Hastings knew that the truth, like the lake's still waters, hid depths yet to be plumbed. Chapter 3. The Arrival of Poirot. The afternoon sun hung low over Blackthorn Manor, its golden rays doing little to dispel the chill that had settled over the estate. The boathouse, now cordoned off with rope and guarded by a young constable, stood as a silent sentinel by the lake, its weathered timbers bearing witness to the morning's tragedy. Inside the manor, the air was thick with tension, the guests moving like actors in a play, their every gesture weighted with unspoken meaning. Captain Arthur Hastings, seated in the library with a notebook in hand, scribbled his observations,
his mind racing to make sense of Rupert Langley's death.
The cufflink, the revolver, Clara's scream, each detail seemed a piece of a puzzle he could not yet solve.
A soft knock at the door broke his reverie. The butler, as imperturbable as ever, announced,
"A gentleman to see you, Captain Hastings, Monsieur Hercule Poirot."
Hastings' heart lifted. He rose, smoothing his jacket, and strode to the entrance hall, where the diminutive figure of Hercule Poirot stood, his patent leather shoes gleaming, his mustache waxed to perfection. Despite the somber occasion, Poirot's green eyes sparkled with their usual keenness, and his neat black suit was as pristine as if he had stepped from a tailor's shop. In one gloved hand he held a silver-tipped cane, in the other, a small valise.
"Mon ami!"
Poirot exclaimed, his voice warm but precise.
"You sent for me, and here I am, summoned by the scent of mystery. Tell me, Hastings, what has transpired in this grande maison?"
Hastings, relieved beyond measure, recounted the events, the uneasy dinner, Lady Langley's cryptic announcement, Rupert's absence at breakfast, and the grim discovery by the boathouse. He described the revolver, the cufflink, and the footprints, his words tumbling out as Poirot listened, his head tilted slightly, his fingers steepled beneath his chin.
"Eh bien,"
Poirot said at last, his tone thoughtful.
"A death, a revolver, a circle of suspects, c'est très intéressant. But tell me, Hastings, what is your impression of these people? The heart of the mystery lies not in the weapon, but in the souls who surround it."
Hastings hesitated, choosing his words.
"They're all hiding something, Poirot. Clara's grief seems genuine, but there's a theatrical quality to it. Lady Langley is composed, but I sense she knows more than she lets on. The others, Dr. Everett, Evelyn, the Warwicks, Colonel Blake, Miss Finch, they're all guarded, as if they fear saying too much."
Poirot nodded, his eyes narrowing.
"Bon, you have observed well, mon ami. Now let us see this scene for ourselves, and then I shall meet these guarded souls."
They made their way to the boathouse, where Inspector Hargrove was overseeing the removal of Rupert's body. The inspector, his mustache bristling, greeted Poirot with a mix of skepticism and grudging respect.
"Heard of you, Mr. Poirot," he said. "Fancy yourself a detective, eh? Well, this looks like a straightforward suicide, but you're welcome to poke around."
Poirot's smile was polite but enigmatic.
"Merci, Inspector. I do not poke, as you say. I observe, I reflect, and I deduce. May I examine the scene?"
Hargrove grunted his assent, and Poirot approached the spot where Rupert had fallen. He moved with deliberate care, his eyes to the lake and back. "Curieux," he murmured. The prints are deep here, shallow there. And this cufflink. He picked it up with a handkerchief, turning it in the light. Ah, hell. Most convenient, no? Hastings frowned. You think it was planted? Poirot's lips twitched. I think nothing yet. But I observe that it is very prominent for something lost in a struggle. He slipped the cufflink into his pocket and turned to the revolver, noting its position. A Webley, oui? Standard, reliable. But the angle of the wound, Hastings, did you notice? It suggests a shot from above, not the hand of a man taking his own life. Before Hastings could respond, Lady Langley approached, her face pale but composed. Monsieur Poirot, she said, her voice steady. I am grateful you've come. My nephew's death is a terrible blow, and I cannot believe he would end his own life. Will you help us? Poirot bowed slightly. Madame, I shall do all in my power to uncover the truth, but I must ask, your announcement last night, what was its nature? Lady Langley's eyes flickered, but she met his gaze. I intended to discuss the future of Blackthorn Manor. My late husband's will left certain complexities. I wish to resolve them with my guests present. And these complexities? Poirot pressed gently. She hesitated, then said, They concern the inheritance of the estate, but I fear I must say no more until the matter is settled. Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. Very well, madame. I shall begin my inquiries. May I speak with your guests? Of course, she replied, gesturing toward the manor. They are in the drawing room, awaiting your questions. Inside, the guests were gathered, their faces a study in unease. Clara sat by the window, her eyes red but dry, a handkerchief clutched in her hand. Dr. Everett and Evelyn stood near the fireplace, murmuring quietly. Colonel Blake paced, his cane tapping rhythmically, while Gerald and Margaret Warwick sat stiffly on a sofa, their hands clasped. Miss Finch, as ever, hovered at the edge, her gray eyes watchful. Poirot entered with a flourish, his presence commanding, despite his small stature. Mesdames et messieurs, he began, his voice clear and precise. I am Hercule Poirot, and I am here to uncover the truth of Monsieur Rupert Langley's death. I shall ask questions, and I ask that you answer with honesty. The smallest detail may be the key to justice. He began with Clara, his tone gentle but probing. Madame Langley, when did you last see your husband alive? Clara's voice trembled. Troubled? Poirot nodded, turning to Dr. Everett. Monsieur le Docteur, you examined the body. Your observations, s'il vous plaît. Dr. Everett cleared his throat. The wound was from a single gunshot, to the chest. Death was instantaneous. I saw no signs of a struggle, but the angle seemed unusual for a self-inflicted wound. Précisément, Poirot murmured, his eyes gleaming. He moved to Colonel Blake. Monsieur le Colonel, you are familiar with firearms, oui? A Webley revolver such as the one found? Would it be a weapon you recognize? Blake's mustache twitched. Standard issue in my day. Reliable. Deadly at close range. If Rupert used it on himself, he'd have needed a steady hand. And you, Mademoiselle Finch? Poirot turned to the companion, who started slightly. You are observant, no? Did you notice anything unusual last night?
Miss Finch's voice was soft but clear.
Mr. Langley seemed distracted at dinner. He kept glancing at his watch as though expecting something. I thought little of it at the time.
Poirot's questions continued, each guest revealing fragments of their movements and observations. Gerald Warwick admitted to a late-night walk in the garden, claiming he needed air. Margaret confirmed she had retired early, citing a headache. Evelyn said she'd stayed up reading until 11, while Dr. Everett claimed to have been in his room by 10. Colonel Blake, ever bluff, said he'd had a brandy in the library and gone to bed. As the interviews concluded, Poirot stood, his hands clasped behind his back.
Merci, all of you. I shall reflect on what you have told me, but know this. The truth cannot hide from Hercule Poirot. I shall find it in the small things, the glance, the gesture, the word unspoken.
As the group dispersed, Hastings caught Poirot's eye. "What do you make of it?" he whispered. Poirot's smile was enigmatic.
The stage is set, mon ami. The players are nervous, and the clues are many. But the truth, it lies in the contradictions. We shall see.
Outside, the clock struck 4, its chimes echoing through the manor. Hastings felt a shiver, knowing that Poirot's arrival had set the wheels of justice in motion, and that the secrets of Blackthorn Manor would soon be laid bare. Chapter 4. The Questions Deepen. The late afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of Blackthorn Manor's drawing room, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Hercule Poirot sat in a high-backed chair, his small frame upright, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his green eyes scanning the room with the precision of a jeweler examining a flawed gem. Captain Arthur Hastings stood by the fireplace, his notebook open, jotting down details as Poirot conducted his interviews.
Inspector Hargrove had departed to confer with the coroner, leaving Poirot to pursue his inquiries with a free hand. The Belgian detective had requested a detailed account of each guest's movements from dinner the previous night until the discovery of Rupert Langley's body at 11 that morning. "It is in the order of events, mes amis," Poirot had said, his voice calm but commanding, "that we find the pattern of truth. Every moment, every step must be accounted for." He began with Lady Beatrice Langley, who sat across from him, her silver hair catching the light like a halo. Her composure was impeccable, but Hastings noted the slight tremor in her hands as she smoothed her skirt. "Madame," Poirot said, his tone deferential yet probing, "you mentioned last night an announcement regarding the future of Blackthorn Manor. Might you share more now that tragedy has struck?" Lady Langley's lips tightened. "Monsieur Poirot, I intended to reveal the details tonight, but given the circumstances, I planned to amend my will. The estate was to pass to Rupert as my closest heir, but with certain conditions. I wished to ensure the manor remained a family legacy, not a commodity to be sold." "And these conditions?" Poirot asked, his mustache twitching slightly. "They concerned Rupert's financial indiscretions," she said carefully. "He had debts, significant ones. I intended to impose a trust to manage the estate's funds, ensuring its preservation." A murmur rippled through the room. Clara Langley, seated near the window, flinched as though struck, her violet eyes darting to Lady Langley. "Debts," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Rupert never told me." Poirot turned to her, his gaze softening but no less sharp. "Madame Clara, your husband did not confide in you about his financial troubles? This is most curious, no? A husband and wife, they share such burdens, do they not?" Clara's hands twisted her handkerchief. He was private about money. I knew he was worried, but he said it was business, nothing more. I trusted him." Poirot nodded, filing the information away. He turned to Dr. Malcolm Everett, whose kindly face was etched with fatigue.
"Monsieur le Docteur, you were close to the family, oui?
Did you know of Monsieur Rupert's troubles? Dr. Everett hesitated, his fingers brushing his white hair. I knew he was under strain, he admitted. Rupert consulted me some weeks ago, not as a doctor, but as a friend. He mentioned debts, but was vague.
Mademoiselle Evelyn, where were you between 10 last night and 11 this morning? Evelyn blushed slightly. I was in my room until 10:30, reading. Then I went to the library for a new book. I saw no one until breakfast. Poirot's gaze shifted to Colonel Reginald Blake, whose mustache bristled as he met the detective's eyes. Monsieur le Colonel, you spoke of a brandy in the library last night. At what time did you retire? Blake cleared his throat. Must have been around 10:15. I lingered over my drink, then went straight to bed. Didn't see Rupert or anyone else. And this morning? Poirot pressed. Up at 6, as always, Blake said, his voice firm. Took a walk around the grounds before breakfast. Saw nothing unusual. Poirot turned to Gerald Warwick, whose spectacles glinted nervously. Monsieur Warwick, you mentioned a walk in the garden last night. At what hour? And did you see Monsieur Rupert? Gerald adjusted his glasses. It was around 10:30, perhaps a bit later. I needed air after dinner. I didn't see Rupert, but I heard footsteps near the rose garden. I thought it might be one of the staff. Margaret Warwick, beside him, nodded vigorously. I was in our room by 9:30 with a headache. Gerald came in just before 11, I believe. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly, but he moved on to Miss Diana Finch, who stood quietly by the door, her mousy appearance belying the sharpness in her gaze. Mademoiselle Finch, you are the eyes and ears of this house, no? What did you observe last night? Miss Finch's voice was steady. I retired to my room at 10, after ensuring Lady Langley had everything she needed. I heard someone moving in the corridor around 10:45, but I didn't look out. This morning I was up at 7, assisting with breakfast preparations. Poirot leaned back, his fingers steepled. Merci, all of you. Your accounts are most illuminating. But let us be clear. Someone in this house knows more than they have said. The truth. It hides in the small details. The hour, the glance, the misplaced object. As the guests dispersed, Hastings followed Poirot to the library, where the detective began pacing, his cane tapping lightly on the floor. What do you make of it, Poirot? Hastings asked, his notebook still in hand. Their stories don't quite align. Gerald's walk, Evelyn's library visit, the footsteps Miss Finch heard. They're all vague. Poirot stopped, his eyes bright with thought. Exactement, Hastings. It is the vagueness that interests me. Each account seems. The revolver, the footprints, the cufflink, they tell a story, but not the one we are meant to believe. We must look deeper into the hearts of these people, for it is there, in their secrets, that the truth lies. Poirot requested a map of the manor and its grounds, which the butler promptly provided. He studied it intently, noting the layout of the boathouse, the lake, and the paths leading to the gardens. The footprints, he murmured. They go to the lake and back. But why? And why only one set? If Rupert was shot, where is the killer's trail? Hastings frowned. Could the killer have approached by boat? Poirot's eyes gleamed. A possibility, Hastings, but unlikely. The lake is shallow, the boathouse unused. No, the answer is simpler, yet more complex. We must examine the alibis more closely. They returned to the boathouse, where Poirot knelt again, studying the ground.
He pointed to a faint indentation in the grass, barely visible. Regarde, Hastings. A mark, perhaps from a stick or cane. It is not deep, but it is deliberate. And here, he gestured to a patch of mud near the revolver. The texture is disturbed, as though something was dragged. Hastings' mind raced. You think the scene was staged? Poirot stood, brushing his hands. I think, mon ami, that someone wishes us to believe in a suicide, but the little gray cells, they protest. The angle of the wound, the placement of the cufflink, the single set of footprints, these are not accidents, they are a performance. As they walked back to the manor, the clock struck 6, its chimes echoing across the grounds. The guests were gathering for dinner, their faces pale and strained. Hastings felt a pang of unease, knowing that Poirot's questions had stirred the pot, and that the truth, like a shadow, was creeping closer. He glanced at his friend, whose calm demeanor belied the storm of deduction brewing within. The game was afoot, and Hercule Poirot was in his element. Chapter 5. The Red Herrings. The dining room of Blackthorn Manor was a study in muted elegance as the guests gathered for dinner, the chandelier casting a soft glow over the polished mahogany table. The atmosphere, however, was anything but warm. The shadow of Rupert Langley's death hung over the room like a pall, and the clink of silverware against fine china sounded unnaturally loud in the strained silence. Captain Arthur Hastings, seated near Hercule Poirot, observed the guests with a heightened awareness, his friend's earlier deductions echoing in his mind. Poirot, impeccable in his black dinner jacket, sipped his wine with deliberate calm, his green eyes darting from face to sat. Dr. Malcolm Everett and his niece Evelyn Carter exchanged occasional whispers, their expressions guarded. Colonel Reginald Blake, his military bearing undiminished, recounted a terse anecdote about a campaign in Burma, but his usual bluster seemed forced. Gerald and Margaret Warwick sat close together, their faces taut, while Miss Diana Finch, ever unobtrusive, watched the proceedings with her sharp, gray eyes. Poirot, true to form, waited until the main course, roast lamb with rosemary, was served before steering the conversation toward the morning's tragedy. Mesdames et messieurs, he began, his voice cutting through the murmur. I have spent the day considering the sad fate of Monsieur Rupert Langley. The police, they believe it a suicide, but I, Hercule Poirot, am not so convinced. There are inconsistencies, no? A ripple of unease passed through the room. Colonel Blake set down his glass with a thud. Inconsistencies? What are you implying, Poirot? The revolver was right there, and the poor chap had debts. Seems clear enough to me. Poirot's smile was polite but unyielding. Clarity, Monsieur le Colonel, is often an illusion. The revolver, oui, it was found, but its position, the angle of the wound, these things, they do not align so neatly with suicide. And then there is the cufflink, engraved with Monsieur Rupert's initials, placed so conveniently in the grass. It is, perhaps, too convenient, no? Clara's head snapped up, her voice trembling. What are you saying? That someone killed Rupert? But who would do such a thing? Poirot turned to her, his tone gentle but probing. That, Madame Clara, is what I seek to discover. You say your husband was troubled, yet you knew nothing of his debts. Did he have enemies, perhaps? Someone who wished him harm? Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she shook her head. No, No one. Rupert was charming, well-liked. He had his faults, but enemies? I can't believe it. Hastings, watching closely, noted the way her hands twisted her napkin, the slight quiver in her voice. Was it grief or something else? He glanced at Poirot, whose expression remained inscrutable. Inspector Hargrove, who had returned to the manor for further inquiries, was seated at the table as an observer. He cleared his throat, his mustache bristling. "Mr. Poirot, we've had the coroner's preliminary report. The wound—"
Poirot. Rupert was in debt, as Lady Langley said. Perhaps the pressure was too much. Why complicate matters? Poirot turned to the solicitor, his gaze piercing. "Monsieur Warwick, you were in the garden last night, oui? At 10:30 you heard footsteps. Could they have been Monsieur Rupert's?" Gerald adjusted his spectacles, his face paling. I suppose it's possible. It was dark, and I didn't see clearly. I assumed it was the servant." "And you, Madame Warwick?" Poirot continued, shifting his attention to Margaret. "You retired early with a headache. Yet your husband returned near 11. Did you hear nothing unusual from your room?" Margaret's hands fluttered nervously. "No, nothing. I took a sleeping draught and was out by 10. Poirot nodded, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. "And Mademoiselle Evelyn, you were in the library until 11, oui? Did you see Monsieur Warwick or anyone else during your visit?" Evelyn's cheeks flushed. "No, I was alone. I found a book, Jane Austen, I think, and went back to my room." Dr. Everett interjected, his tone defensive. "My niece is a light sleeper, Poirot. If there was anything amiss, she'd have heard it." Poirot's smile was enigmatic. "Perhaps, Monsieur le Docteur. And you, Mademoiselle Finch, you heard movement in the corridor at 10:45. Could you describe it?" Miss Finch's voice was calm but precise. It was a soft tread, like someone trying not to be heard. I assumed it was one of the guests retiring for the night. The room fell silent, the weight of Poirot's questions pressing down on them. Hastings, scribbling in his notebook, felt a growing certainty that the detective was deliberately stirring the waters, casting suspicion to see who would flinch. The idea of suicide, so readily accepted by Hargrove, seemed increasingly flimsy, yet the alternative, murder, pointed to one of the people in this very room. As dessert, a delicate lemon soufflé was served. Poirot leaned back, his eyes half closed. "Let us consider, mes amis, a possibility. Suppose Monsieur Rupert did not take his own life. Suppose someone arranged the scene, the revolver, the cufflink, the footprints, to suggest he did. This person, they are clever, but they cannot hide everything. There is always a slip, a detail that betrays them." Colonel Blake snorted. "You're suggesting one of us is a murderer. Preposterous. We're respectable people, Poirot." "Respectability, Monsieur le Colonel, is a mask," Poirot replied smoothly. "And masks, they can be removed." The water's edge. Why? And this mark. He tapped the spot where he'd found the faint indentation. It is not a footprint, but perhaps a cane, or something dragged to obscure another trail. Hastings frowned. "You think someone tampered with the scene after the fact?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "I think, mon ami, that we are dealing with a mind that plans carefully, but overlooks the small things. The cufflink, for instance. It is too obvious. A red herring meant to distract. And the revolver, wiped clean save for Rupert's prints, It is the work of someone who knows how to stage a crime. But who, Poirot? Hastings asked, his voice low. Clara has the strongest motive, with Rupert's debts, but her grief seems real. And Lady Langley, could she have known more about Rupert's troubles than she admits? Poirot's smile was cryptic. All are possible, Hastings, but we must not leap to conclusions. The truth, it lies in the contradictions, times that do not align, glances that betray, objects that do not belong. Tomorrow we shall examine the boathouse again, and I shall speak with the servants. They too see much that others miss. As the clock struck 9, its chimes echoing through the manor, Hastings felt a chill. The guests were dispersing to their rooms, their footsteps heavy with dread. Poirot, however, seemed invigorated, his mind a whirl of deductions. "The net tightens, mon ami," he murmured. "The killer is here among us, and they grow nervous. We shall see who breaks first." Hastings nodded, his thoughts racing. The red herrings were many, but Poirot's little gray cells were relentless, and the truth, he knew, could not remain hidden for long. Chapter 6. A Clue in Detail. The morning mist clung to the grounds of Blackthorn Manor, veiling the lake and the boathouse in a ghostly shroud. Hercule Poirot, clad in a meticulously tailored overcoat, stood by the boathouse, his silver-tipped cane resting lightly in the damp grass. Captain Arthur Hastings, ever at his side, adjusted his scarf against the chill, his notebook open to a fresh page. The events of the previous evening, the strained dinner, Poirot's pointed questions, and the palpable unease among the guests had left Hastings restless, his mind buzzing with the inconsistencies Poirot had begun to unravel. "Regardez, Hastings," Poirot said, his voice low but clear, as he gestured toward the ground near the boathouse door.
Hastings frowned, crouching beside him. "You think the killer covered their tracks?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "I think, mon ami, that someone has taken great care to shape the scene. But the little gray cells, they see what is hidden. Come, let us examine the boathouse itself." Inside, the air was damp and musty, the wooden walls warped by years of neglect. The revolver had been taken by Inspector Hargrove for analysis, but Poirot's attention was drawn to a small table in the corner, its surface scarred and dusty. He ran a finger along its edge, pausing at a faint scratch, barely visible in the dim light. "Curieux," he murmured, producing a pocket magnifying glass. "This mark, it is fresh. And here," he pointed to a tiny splinter of wood caught in the scratch. "It is painted, Hastings. Green, like the handle of a garden tool, perhaps." Hastings's eyes widened. "A garden tool? But why would one be here?" Poirot's smile was enigmatic. "That, mon ami, is the question. Let us return to the manor. I wish to speak with the servants, for they see what the guests do not." Back at the manor, the household was stirring, though the atmosphere remained heavy with suspicion. Lady Beatrice Langley had cancelled the morning's planned activities, citing the need for decorum in light of Rupert's death. The guests were scattered, Clara in her room, Dr. Everett and Evelyn in the library, Colonel Blake pacing the terrace, and the Warwicks murmuring in a corner of the drawing room. Miss Diana Finch moved silently through the halls, her presence as unobtrusive as ever. Poirot requested a private audience with the butler, Mr. Grayson, a man of 50 with a face as impassive as stone. They met in the small parlor off the kitchen, where Poirot sat, his hands folded, his demeanor calm but commanding. "Monsieur Grayson," he began, "you are the heart of this house, no? You see all, hear all. Tell me,
What did you observe on the night of Monsieur Rupert's death? Grayson's posture remained rigid, but his eyes flickered. I retired at 10, sir, after ensuring the house was secure. I heard nothing unusual, though I did see Mr. Rupert leave the dining room around 9:30, looking agitated. And this morning? Poirot pressed. Before the body was found. I was up at 6, sir, overseeing breakfast preparations. I noticed the garden shed door was ajar, which was unusual. I closed it, but thought little of it at the time. Poirot's mustache twitched. The garden shed, you say? And what tools are kept there? Rakes, shovels, a trowel, sir. The usual gardening implements. All painted green on the handles for easy identification. Poirot nodded.
Finch in the corridor near Rupert's room at 10:45, carrying a tray of tea things. She looked startled when she saw me, Ellen said, her voice barely above a whisper, but she said it was just Lady Langley's bedtime tea. Poirot thanked her and dismissed her, turning to Hastings. The shed, the tea tray, the scratch in the boathouse. These are the small things, Hastings, that point to the truth. But we must be patient. The killer, they grow nervous, and nervous people make mistakes. Returning to the drawing room, Poirot gathered the guests, his presence drawing their attention like a magnet. Mesdames et messieurs, he said, his voice clear. I have learned much today, but one detail intrigues me. A garden tool, perhaps, was used to tamper with the scene of Monsieur Rupert's death. Can any of you account for the garden shed being open this morning? A heavy silence followed. Colonel Blake's cane tapped the floor, a sharp, involuntary sound. Ridiculous, he muttered. Probably a careless servant. Gerald Warwick adjusted his spectacles. I was in the garden last night, as I said, but I didn't go near the shed. Clara's voice was faint. Rupert sometimes worked in the garden when he was troubled. He said it calmed him. Perhaps he went there. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Perhaps, Madame Clara. And you, Mademoiselle Finch, you were seen in the corridor at 10:45 carrying a tray. Was it only tea you carried? Miss Finch's grey eyes met his, unflinching. Yes, Monsieur Poirot. Lady Langley's tea, as always. I took it to her room and retired. Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. Very well. I ask that you all remain vigilant. The truth, it is close, but it requires one more piece to complete the picture. As the group dispersed, Hastings followed Poirot to the garden shed, a small structure tucked behind the rose garden. The door, now closed, bore a sturdy lock, but Poirot noted faint scratches around the latch, as though it had been forced. Inside, the tools were neatly arranged, their green-painted handles gleaming. Poirot examined a shovel, its blade clean but for a faint smudge of mud. This, he said, may be our missing link. The mud matches that near the boathouse, no? Hastings' mind raced. You think someone used it to drag something, perhaps to cover tracks? Precisimo, Poirot replied. But why? To hide their presence or to create the illusion of Rupert's solitude? We must consider the times. Gerald was in the garden at 10:30. Evelyn, based on body temperature and rigor mortis. Still looks like suicide, Hargrove said. No other fingerprints, no signs of a struggle. Poirot's smile was tight. And yet, Inspector, the scene is too perfect. The cufflink, the footprints, the revolver, they are staged, like a play. But the little gray cells, they see the flaw in the script. As the clock struck noon, its chimes echoing through the manor, Hastings felt a growing certainty that Poirot was closing in on the truth. The garden tool, the scratches, the mismatched alibis. They were threads in a tapestry of deception, and Poirot was unraveling them one by one. The guests, he knew, were watching, their nerves fraying as the detective's questions grew sharper. The killer was among them, and the net was tightening. 1980. Chapter 7. More Lies Surface. The afternoon sun cast a feeble glow through the leaded windows of Blackthorn Manor, doing little to warm the oppressive atmosphere within. The guests, confined to the manor by Inspector Hargrove's orders, moved restlessly through its halls, their faces etched with unease. Hercule Poirot, seated in the library with Captain Arthur Hastings at his side, pored over the map of the estate, his fingers tracing the path from the manor to the boathouse. His green eyes gleamed with the intensity of a man closing in on his quarry, though his demeanor remained as composed as ever, his mustache perfectly symmetrical above his thoughtful frown. "Hastings, mon ami," Poirot said, his voice low. "The truth, it begins to emerge, like a photograph in the developing tray. The garden tool, the scratched table, the footprints, they are pieces of a puzzle, but it is the human heart that holds the key. Today we shall uncover more of these secrets." Hastings nodded, his notebook filled with scribbled observations. The previous day's discoveries, the green-painted shovel, the faint groove near the boathouse, Miss Finch's tea tray, had deepened his conviction that Rupert Langley's death was no suicide. Yet the guests' alibis, though vague, were maddeningly consistent, each carefully crafted to avoid direct contradiction. "Who do you suspect, Poirot?" he asked. "They all seem to have something to hide." Poirot's smile was enigmatic. "Exactement, Hastings. They all hide, but some hide more than others. We must apply pressure, no? A little push, and the truth will spill." Poirot requested a private meeting with each guest, beginning with Clara Langley. They met in the wooden chair. A week ago, I overheard him arguing with someone on the telephone, angry words about money owed. I didn't catch the name. Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And this argument, it was heated, Did he mention a place, a time, anything specific?" Clara hesitated, then shook her head. "Only that he needed to settle things before the weekend. I thought it was business, nothing more." Poirot nodded, dismissing her gently. Next, he summoned Dr. Malcolm Everett, whose kindly face was drawn with fatigue. "Monsieur le Docteur," Poirot said, "you knew of Rupert's troubles, yet you did not press him for details. Why?" Everett sighed, his fingers brushing his white hair. "Rupert was like a son to me, in a way. I didn't want to pry. He mentioned a creditor, someone pressing him hard, but he wouldn't say who. I urged him to tell Lady Langley, to seek her help. And did he?" Poirot asked. "I don't know," Everett admitted. "He seemed afraid, almost. Not of Lady Langley, but of something else." Evelyn Carter was next, her auburn curls bouncing as she entered, though her usual vivacity was subdued. "Mademoiselle Evelyn," Poirot said, "you were in the library until 11, yet you saw no one. Is there anything else you recall from that night?" Evelyn bit her lip, her eyes darting to the side. I didn't want to say before, but I did see something. As I left the library, I glimpsed a figure in the garden, near the rose arbor. It was dark, but I think it was a man, moving quickly." Poirot leaned forward. "And you did not think to mention this, mademoiselle?" "Why?" "I wasn't sure," she said quickly. "It could have been a servant or nothing. I didn't want to cause a fuss." Poirot's gaze was unrelenting. "In a murder, mademoiselle, there is no such thing as nothing." Colonel Reginald Blake entered next, his cane tapping sharply on the floor. "Monsieur le Colonel," Poirot said, "you are a man of discipline, yet you saw nothing unusual during your walk at 6 this morning? The garden shed, perhaps, was open?" Blake's mustache bristled. "I don't skulk around sheds, Poirot. I walked the main path as I said, saw nothing out of the ordinary." "And your brandy in the library," Poirot continued. "You lingered until 10:15. Did you hear footsteps, voices, anything?" Blake hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "Now that you mention it, I did hear something. A rustle outside the window. Thought it was the wind, but it could have been someone too dark to see clearly." I assumed it was Rupert, or perhaps a servant. And you, Madame Marguerite, Poirot said, turning to her. Your headache kept you in your room, yet you heard nothing? Not even your husband's return at 11? Margaret's hands fluttered. I took a sleeping draught, as I said. I was asleep by 10. Poirot's eyes lingered on her, then moved to Miss Diana Finch, who entered last, her mousy demeanor belying the sharpness in her gaze. Mademoiselle Finch, he said, you carried a tea tray at 10:45, yet the housemaid, Ellen, said you looked startled. Why? Miss Finch's voice was steady. I was surprised to see her, that's all. The corridor was quiet, and I wasn't expecting anyone. And the tray, Poirot pressed. It contained only tea. Yes, she said firmly. Lady Langley's chamomile, as always. Poirot leaned back, his fingers steepled. Merci, mademoiselle. You have all given me much to consider. As the interviews concluded, Poirot and Hastings retired to the library, where Poirot spread out his notes beside the map. The lies, Hastings, they multiply, he said, his voice low. Clara overhears an argument, yet says nothing. Evelyn sees a figure, but keeps silent. Blake hears a rustle. Warwick footsteps. Finch is startled. Each holds back a piece of the truth. Hastings frowned. But what does it mean? Are they all involved? Not all, mon ami, Poirot said, his eyes gleaming. But someone is at the center of this web. The telephone argument Clara mentioned. It is a clue, no? We must learn who Rupert spoke with. And the figure in the garden, Evelyn's sighting aligns with Warwick's footsteps, yet neither saw the other clearly. This is no coincidence. Poirot requested access to the Manor's telephone records, a task Inspector Hargrove grudgingly facilitated. The records, retrieved from the local exchange, showed a call from Blackthorn Manor at 9:15 the previous night to a number in London. A creditor, perhaps, Poirot mused, or someone with a hold over Rupert. He turned to the map, pointing to the rose arbor. The figure Evelyn saw. It was near here where Warwick walked, and the shed, with its scratched lock and green-handled shovel, is close by. The truth was drawing nearer, like a shadow cast by the setting sun. Chapter 8. The Emotional Turning Point. The twilight cast a somber veil over Blackthorn Manor, its shadows lengthening across the polished floors as the guests gathered in the drawing room for an impromptu tea. The air was thick with unspoken dread, each person acutely aware of the invisible net Hercule Poirot was weaving with his relentless questions. Captain Arthur Hastings, seated near a window overlooking the darkening gardens, clutched his notebook, his eyes darting between the guests. Poirot, impeccable as ever in his tailored suit, sipped his tisane with deliberate calm, his green eyes scanning the room like a hawk circling its prey. The revelations of the day, the telephone argument, the figure in the garden, the tampered shed, had stirred the pot, and Hastings sensed that the pressure was nearing a breaking point. Poirot, with his uncanny knack for reading the human heart, seemed to sense it too. He set down his cup, his movements precise, and addressed the room, his voice cutting through the murmur like a blade. Mesdames et messieurs, he said, we approach the heart of this tragedy. Monsieur Rupert Langley did not die by his own hand, I am certain. The clues, the shovel, the cufflink, the footprints, they point to a careful plan, but one that is unraveling. I ask you now, if there is something you have withheld, to speak. The truth. It cannot be hidden forever. A heavy silence followed, broken only by the crackle of the fire in the hearth. Clara Langley, her face pale and drawn, clutched her handkerchief, her violet eyes glistening with unshed tears. Dr. Malcolm Everett stared into his tea, his fingers trembling slightly. Evelyn Carter, usually so vivacious, sat rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Colonel Reginald Blake's mustache twitched, his cane tapping an erratic rhythm on the floor. Gerald and Margaret Warwick exchanged a glance, their faces taut, while Miss Diana Finch, ever watchful, stood by the door, her gray eyes unreadable. It was Evelyn who broke first, her voice trembling as she rose to her feet. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her auburn curls trembling with her agitation. I can't keep silent any longer. I saw more that night than I admitted. The figure in the garden. It wasn't just a shadow. I recognized him. It was Rupert, and he was arguing with someone, near the rose arbor. I couldn't hear the words, but he was angry, gesturing wildly. Poirot's eyes gleamed, but his tone remained gentle. "Mademoiselle Evelyn, this is most significant. Why did you not speak of this before?" "Evelyn,
And this someone," Poirot pressed. "Did you see who it was?" Evelyn hesitated, her eyes darting to Clara, then away. "I couldn't see clearly. It was dark, and they were partly hidden by the arbor. But it was a man, I'm sure. A tall man, with a coat." A murmur rippled through the room. Colonel Blake's cane stopped tapping, and Gerald Warwick's spectacles glinted as he leaned forward. Clara's head snapped up, her voice sharp. "A man? You're saying someone was with Rupert that night? Why didn't you tell me?" Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't want to hurt you, Clara. You were already so upset, and I wasn't sure what I saw. I thought it might be nothing." Poirot raised a hand, silencing the rising tension. "Mademoiselle Evelyn, your courage does you credit, but let us be clear. This figure, this argument, it is a piece of the puzzle. Monsieur Warwick, you were in the garden at 10:30, oui? Did you see Monsieur Rupert or this other man?" Gerald's face paled, his hands fidgeting. "I told you I heard footsteps, but I didn't see anyone clearly. It was too dark. I swear I didn't see Rupert." Margaret Warwick reached for her husband's arm, her voice trembling. "Gerald was with me by 11, Monsieur Poirot. He wouldn't have done anything to harm Rupert." Poirot's gaze shifted to Colonel Blake. "And you, Monsieur le Colonel, you heard a rustle outside the library window at 10:15? Could it have been this argument Mademoiselle Evelyn witnessed?" Blake's face reddened. "I told you it was probably the wind. I didn't see anyone, and I certainly didn't hear an argument." Poirot turned to Clara, his tone softening. "Madame Clara, you overheard your husband on the telephone, speaking of money owed. Did he ever mention a name, a place, anything that might identify this creditor?" Clara's hands twisted her handkerchief into a knot. "No, he didn't. But there was a letter a few days ago. I found it in his study, half burned in the grate. It mentioned a meeting here at the manor to settle accounts. I thought it was business, but now—" Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands. Poirot's eyes gleamed with interest. "A letter, madame. This is most important. Can you recall anything else about it?" Clara shook her head, her voice muffled. "It was typed, not handwritten. The paper was plain, but there was a smudge, like ink or soot. I didn't think it mattered then." Poirot nodded, filing the detail away. He turned to Miss Finch, who had remained silent, her gray eyes watchful. "Mademoiselle Finch, you were in the corridor at 10:45, carrying a tea tray. Did you, perhaps, see or hear this argument in the garden?" Miss Finch's voice was calm, steady, but laced with pain. "Monsieur Poirot, my nephew's death is a tragedy, but these accusations, they tear at us all. Is it not possible that Rupert, overwhelmed by his troubles, took his own life?" Poirot's smile was gentle but resolute. "Madame, I understand your pain, but the evidence, it does not support suicide. The letter, the argument, the tempered scene, these are the marks of a human hand, not fate. Someone in this room knows more than they have said." The clock struck 7, its chimes resonating like a warning through the manor. The guests sat frozen, Evelyn's confession hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Hastings, scribbling furiously, noted the tension in their faces. Clara's anguish, Gerald's nervousness, Blake's defiance. Even Miss Finch, usually so composed, seemed shaken,
her fingers tightening on her shawl. Poirot rose, his small frame commanding the room. Mes amis, we are close to the truth, but it requires one final push. I ask you to reflect on what you know, what you have seen. Tomorrow, I shall gather you again, and we shall see who cannot bear the weight of their secrets. As the guests dispersed, their footsteps heavy with dread, Hastings followed Poirot to the library, where the detective spread out his notes and the Manor's map. Evelyn's confession, Hastings said. It changes everything. If Rupert was arguing with someone, that's the killer, isn't it? Poirot's eyes twinkled. Perhaps, mon ami, but we must be cautious. Evelyn's story, it is a crack in the facade, but is it the whole truth? The letter Clara mentioned, the figure in the garden, these are threads we must follow. And the shovel, with its green handle, it ties to the shed, to the scene. Someone planned this crime, Hastings, and they are watching us now. Poirot requested the half-burned letter from Clara, who retrieved it from Rupert's study. It was crumpled, its edges charred, but legible enough to confirm her account. A typed note, demanding a meeting at the Manor to settle accounts. The smudge, Poirot noted, was indeed ink, and a faint trace of wax suggested a seal had been removed. The letter, it is anonymous, Poirot said, but it is no coincidence. The killer wished to lure Rupert to the boathouse, and they succeeded, but they did not count on Hercule Poirot. As the evening deepened, the Manor seemed to close in around them, its walls whispering of secrets yet to be uncovered. Hastings felt the weight of the moment, knowing that Evelyn's emotional break had shifted the game and that Poirot was poised to strike.
Chapter 9. The Trap. The morning air of Blackthorn Manor was crisp, the mist having lifted to reveal a sky of unbroken gray. Inside, the atmosphere was as heavy as the clouds, each guest moving with the cautious tread of one who senses a storm approaching. Hercule Poirot, seated in the library with Captain Arthur Hastings, was in his element, his green eyes alight with the thrill of the chase. The revelations of the previous evening, Evelyn's confession about the argument in the garden, Clara's discovery of the half-burned letter, had tightened the net around the killer, and Poirot was ready to apply the final pressure. Hastings, mon ami, Poirot said, his voice low and deliberate as he adjusted his tie. Today, we set the trap. The killer, they are nervous, their lies fraying like a worn tapestry. We shall gather the guests, and with a little provocation, the truth will emerge. Hastings, his notebook filled with meticulous notes, nodded. Evelyn's story about the argument, it points to a man, doesn't it? Could it be Warwick? Or even Colonel Blake? They were both out that night. Poirot's mustache twitched. Perhaps, but we must not assume. The letter, the shovel, the cufflink, these are not random. The killer has planned carefully, but no plan is perfect. We shall use their own cleverness against them. Poirot requested that Lady Beatrice Langley assemble the guests in the drawing room at noon, under the pretense of discussing the investigation's progress. The butler, Grayson, moved with his usual efficiency, delivering the summons, while Hastings watched the guests' reactions. Clara's face was pale, her hands trembling as she clutched a shawl. Dr. Everett and Evelyn exchanged worried glances, their usual warmth subdued. Colonel Blake's cane tapped restlessly, his bluster replaced by a grim silence. Gerald and Margaret Warwick sat close, their expressions guarded, while Miss Diana Finch, ever unobtrusive, lingered near the door, her gray eyes sharp. At precisely noon, the clock's chimes echoed through the Manor as Poirot entered the drawing room, his small frame radiating authority. The guests sat in a semicircle, their faces a mix of curiosity and dread. Inspector Hargrove, present at Poirot's insistence, stood by the fireplace, his notebook open, his mustache bristling with skepticism. Mesdames et messieurs, Poirot began, his voice clear and commanding, we are gathered to confront the truth of Monsieur Rupert Langley's death. It was no suicide, as some would have us believe. It was murder, planned with care but betrayed by the smallest details. Today, I shall reveal the contradictions that point to the killer. A murmur rippled through the room. Clara's hand flew to her mouth, and Evelyn gripped her uncle's arm. Poirot raised a hand for silence.
Fingerprints suggest suicide, but the angle of the wound, downward, not upward, tells a different story. Someone shot him, then placed a revolver to suggest he fired it himself. Hargrove snorted. No other prints, Poirot, and the footprints only Rupert's to the lake and back. Poirot's smile was enigmatic. Précisément, Inspector. The footprints, they are too perfect. One set, undisturbed, yet the mud near the revolver was tampered with as though something was dragged. And this... He produced the green-painted splinter from his pocket, holding it up. A fragment from a garden tool, found in a scratch on the boathouse table. The shed, its locks scratched, held a shovel with matching mud. Someone used it to obscure another trail. Colonel Blake's cane stopped mid-tap. You're saying the scene was staged? Preposterous. Poirot turned to him, his eyes piercing. Not preposterous, Monsieur le Colonel. Deliberate. And then there is the cufflink, engraved with R.L., found so conveniently in the grass. It is a red herring, meant to confirm Rupert's presence, but it is too obvious, no? Clara's voice trembled. But who would do this? Rupert had no enemies? Poirot's gaze softened, but his tone was firm. Madame Clara, you overheard your husband on the telephone arguing about money owed. The half-burned letter you found, it demanded a meeting to settle accounts. This was no ordinary debt. It was a threat. Oui. Clara nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. I didn't know what it meant. I thought it was business. Poirot turned to Evelyn. Mademoiselle Evelyn, you saw Monsieur Rupert arguing with a man in the garden near the rose arbor at 10:30. Monsieur Warwick, you were in the garden at that time, yet you claim to have seen no one. How is this possible? Gerald's spectacles glinted as he leaned forward. I told you, it was dark. I heard footsteps, but I didn't see Rupert or anyone else. Margaret clutched his arm. He was with me by 11, Monsieur Poirot. He's telling the truth. Poirot's eyes narrowed. And you, Mademoiselle Finch, you were in the corridor at 10:45, carrying a tea tray. Yet the housemaid, Ellen, said you looked startled. Was it more than tea you carried? Miss Finch's face remained impassive. I was surprised. Everett spoke, his voice strained. But why, Poirot? Who had reason to kill him? Poirot stopped, his gaze sweeping the room. Motive, Monsieur le Docteur, lies in the secrets you all keep. Rupert's debts were not merely financial. They were a chain binding him to someone in this room. The letter, the argument, the staged scene, these point to a mind that plans but overlooks the small things. He turned to Lady Langley, who sat rigid, her silver hair gleaming under the chandelier. Madame, your announcement about the will, it threatened someone, did it not? Someone who stood to lose if Rupert inherited under your conditions. Lady Langley's lips tightened. I only wish to protect the estate. Rupert's debts, they were a danger. I had to act. Poirot nodded, then addressed the group. I propose a test, mes amis. Tonight, after dinner, we shall recreate the events of that night. Each of you will take your place as you described. Colonel Blake in the library, Monsieur Warwick in the garden, Mademoiselle Evelyn at the library window, Mademoiselle Finch in the corridor. We shall see if your stories hold. A gasp escaped Evelyn, and Gerald's face paled. Blake's cane tapped sharply, and Clara stifled a sob. Miss Finch's eyes flickered, but she said nothing. Hargrove, frowning, stepped forward. This is irregular, Poirot. What's the point? The point, Inspector, Poirot said, is to catch a killer. One of you will falter, and the truth will be revealed. As the guests dispersed, their faces pale with apprehension, Hastings followed Poirot to the terrace, where the detective lit a cigarette, a rare indulgence. You're pushing them, Poirot, Hastings said. What if the killer tries to run? Poirot exhaled a thin plume of smoke. They will not run, mon ami. They are too clever for that, but they will make a mistake, and we shall be watching. The clock struck 1. Its chimes echoing through the manor like a call to judgment. The trap was set, and Hastings knew that by night's end the killer's mask would slip, revealing the face of guilt beneath. Chapter 10. The Reveal. The dining room of Blackthorn Manor was shrouded in an uneasy hush as the clock struck 8, its chimes reverberating like a prelude to judgment. The guests, summoned by Hercule Poirot for his promised reenactment, sat around the mahogany table, their faces pale under the chandelier's glow. Captain Arthur Hastings, stationed near the door with his notebook, felt the tension coiled tighter, as though the very air held its breath. Poirot, immaculate in his black dinner jacket, stood at the head of the table, his green eyes gleaming with the certainty of a man who had unraveled the final thread of a tangled web. Mesdames, your place as you described. Colonel Blake in the library, Monsieur Warwick in the garden, Mademoiselle Evelyn at the library window, Mademoiselle Finch in the corridor. And yet, the truth has emerged, as it always must, through the little gray cells of Hercule Poirot. A murmur rippled through the room. Clara Langley clutched her handkerchief, her violet eyes wide with dread. Dr. Malcolm Everett sat rigid, his hands clasped tightly. Evelyn Carter's auburn curls trembled as she bit her lip, while Colonel Reginald Blake's cane rested still, his mustache taut. Gerald and Margaret Warwick exchanged a nervous glance, and Miss Diana Finch, standing by the door, watched with her usual quiet intensity. Inspector Hargrove, seated at the table's edge, frowned, his notebook open but untouched. Poirot raised a hand for silence. Let us begin with the facts. Monsieur Rupert was shot between 10 and 11 that night, his body found by the boathouse with a revolver bearing only his fingerprints. The police, they say suicide, but the angle of the wound, downward, not upward, tells us it was murder. The footprints, a single set to the lake and back, were too perfect, the mud tampered with by a green-handled shovel from the shed. A cufflink, engraved RL, was placed to suggest Rupert's presence, and a half-burned letter spoke of a meeting to settle accounts. These are not accidents, mes amis. They are the work of a careful mind. He paced slowly, his cane tapping the floor. The timeline, it is critical. At 9:15, Rupert makes a telephone call, arguing about money owed. At 10, he leaves the dining room, agitated. At 10:15, Colonel Blake hears a rustle outside the library. At 10:30, Mademoiselle Evelyn sees Rupert arguing with a man in the garden, near the rose arbor, and Monsieur Warwick hears footsteps nearby. At 10:45, Mademoiselle Finch is in the corridor, startled by the housemaid, and between 10 and 11, Rupert is shot. Poirot stopped, his gaze sweeping the room. The reenactment tonight has shown us the flaw in this tapestry.
The figure in the garden, seen by Mademoiselle Evelyn, could not have been Monsieur Warwick, for his path took him to the East Garden, not the Rose Arbor, nor could it have been Colonel Blake, who was in the library. But there is one person whose movements do not align, one whose alibi is too vague, too convenient. He turned to Miss Diana Finch, whose gray eyes met his without flinching. Mademoiselle Finch, you were in the corridor at 10:45, carrying a tea tray for Lady Langley. Yet the housemaid, Ellen, said you looked startled, and the tray—
In the garden, meeting Rupert. The letter, the argument, the shovel, all point to you. A gasp escaped Clara, and Evelyn's hand flew to her mouth. Miss Finch's face paled, but she stood her ground.
That's absurd, Monsieur Poirot. I had no reason to harm Rupert.
Poirot raised a finger. Au contraire, mademoiselle, you had every reason. Rupert's debts were not to a distant creditor, but to you. You were his confidant, his shadow, always watching, always listening. He borrowed heavily from you, promising repayment when he inherited the estate. But Lady Langley's announcement, it threatened your investment. If Rupert's inheritance was placed in a trust, you would lose everything. Lady Langley's voice trembled. Diana, is this true? Miss Finch's lips tightened, but she said nothing. Poirot continued, relentless. The letter, typed and anonymous, was your work. Luring Rupert to the boathouse. You met him in the garden, argued and followed him there. You shot him with his own revolver, which you had taken from his room earlier, knowing his fingerprints would be on it. You used the shovel to obscure your tracks, dragging it to create the illusion of a single set of footprints. The cufflink, you placed it to reinforce the suicide story. But you made mistakes, mademoiselle. The scratch on the boathouse table, the empty tray, the startled glance Ellen saw. Miss Finch's composure cracked, her voice rising. You have no proof, Poirot. This is speculation. Poirot produced the half-burned letter, holding it up. The smudge on this letter, mademoiselle. It is not ink, but typewriter ribbon residue, matching the machine in your room. And the shovel. Its mud matches the boathouse exactly. You were seen in the corridor at 10:45, but the garden path to the boathouse takes only 10 minutes. You had time, and you had motive. Miss Finch's eyes blazed, but her shoulders slumped. A silent admission. Hargrove, stunned, rose to his feet. Good God, Poirot, is this true? Poirot nodded. It is the only explanation that fits all the facts. Mademoiselle Finch, she is clever, but not clever enough to fool Hercule Poirot. Clara sobbed, burying her face in her hands. Evelyn clung to Dr. Everett, who looked shaken. Colonel Blake's cane fell silent, and the Warwicks stared in disbelief. Lady Langley's voice was cold. Diana, how could you? Miss Finch's voice was low, almost a whisper. He promised me everything, and then he betrayed me. I couldn't let him ruin me. Hargrove signaled to his sergeant, who approached Miss Finch. Miss Diana Finch, you're under arrest for the murder of Rupert Langley. As she was led away, her head held high despite the cuffs, Poirot turned to the group, his expression somber, the human weight of the revelation settling over them. Hastings, his notebook forgotten, felt a mix of awe and sorrow. Poirot had done it again, piecing together the impossible with nothing but logic and observation. As the clock struck 9, its chimes echoing through the manor, Poirot bowed slightly and stepped toward the door. The truth is revealed, and justice will follow. I bid you good evening. Hastings followed, his mind reeling. The trap had sprung and the killer was caught, but the scars of Blackthorn Manor would linger long after Poirot's departure. Chapter 11. The Reflection.
The morning after the dramatic revelation in Blackthorn Manor's drawing room was subdued, the air heavy with the aftermath of truth laid bare. The mist had returned, cloaking the estate in a veil of gray that mirrored the somber mood within. Hercule Poirot, seated in the library with a cup of tisane, gazed out at the gardens, his green eyes thoughtful, his mustache as impeccable as ever. Captain Arthur Hastings, seated opposite, flipped through his notebook, its pages filled with the intricate details of the case that had culminated in Miss Diana Finch's arrest. The manor felt quieter now, as though relieved of a burden. Yet the scars of betrayal lingered in the guests' drawn faces. "Poirot," Hastings ventured, his voice low. "You were magnificent last night. The way you pieced it all together. The letter, the shovel, the cufflink. It was like watching a maestro conduct a symphony. But how did you know it was Miss Finch?" Poirot set down his cup, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Mon ami, it is always the small things that betray the guilty. The little gray cells, they see what others overlook. Mademoiselle Finch was too careful, too invisible, yet her very discretion was her undoing. The empty tea tray, the startled glance, the typewriter ribbon, these were the threads that wove her guilt." Hastings nodded, still marveling. But her motive, lending money to Rupert, fearing the loss of her investment, it seemed so cold. Poirot's expression softened, a rare flicker of melancholy crossing his face. "The human heart, Hastings, it is a complex machine. Greed, fear, ambition, they drive even the quietest soul to desperate acts. Mademoiselle Finch, she saw herself as a shadow, always serving, never seen. But shadows, they crave substance, and Rupert's promise of repayment gave her hope. When Lady Langley's announcement threatened that hope, she can be betrayed. But you must not blame yourself. The fault lies with Mademoiselle Finch, who chose her path." Lady Langley nodded, her lips tightening. "I have decided to proceed with my announcement, despite this tragedy. The estate will be placed in a trust, not for Rupert, but for his widow Clara, to ensure Blackthorn remains a family legacy. I hope it will bring her some comfort." Poirot's eyes gleamed with approval. "A wise decision, madame. It honors the past and secures the future." As Lady Langley departed, Clara Langley entered, her violet eyes red but resolute. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice trembling, "I can't thank you enough. I thought Rupert's death was my fault, that I failed him somehow. Now I know the truth, and it helps, even if it hurts." Poirot took her hand, his tone gentle. "Madame Clara, you loved your husband, and that is no small thing. His secrets were his own, but they do not diminish your bond. Go forward and live for yourself now." Clara nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks as she left. Hastings watched her go, his heart heavy. "She's been through so much, Poirot. Will she be all right?" Poirot sighed, a rare sound from the usually unflappable detective. "Time, mon ami, is the great healer. She will find her strength, as all must who face such loss." The other guests filtered through the library throughout the morning, each offering their thanks or reflections. Dr. Malcolm Everett, his kindly face etched with sorrow, admitted he should have pressed Rupert harder about his troubles. Evelyn Carter, her auburn curls subdued, expressed relief that the truth was out, though she felt guilt for not speaking sooner. Colonel Reginald Blake, his bluster softened, shook Poirot's hand, muttering, "Damn fine work, sir." Gerald and Margaret Warwick, their nerves eased, thanked Poirot quietly, their earlier defensiveness replaced by gratitude. Inspector Hargrove, ever the skeptic, stopped by last, his mustache twitching. "I'll give you this, Poirot. You've got a nose for it. I'd have called it suicide and closed the case. How do you do it?" Poirot's smile was enigmatic. "It is the method, Inspector. Order and method, applied to the chaos of human nature. The clues, they speak, if one listens." As Hargrove departed, Poirot turned to Hastings, his expression philosophical. "You see, Hastings, the world is full of mysteries, but they are not so mysterious when one observes with care. Become of Hercule Poirot. My purpose it is to bring light to the darkness, to restore order where chaos reigns, and so, I continue." They stepped onto the terrace, where the mist was beginning to lift, revealing the rolling hills beyond. Poirot adjusted his coat, his cane tapping lightly on the stone. "Come, Hastings, our work here is done. The train to London awaits, and I have a craving for a proper choco chaud." Hastings smiled, falling into step beside his friend. "You're incorrigible, Poirot, but I wouldn't have you any other way." As they walked toward the waiting car, the manor loomed behind them, its ivy-clad walls a silent witness to the drama that had unfolded. The guests, freed from suspicion, would begin to heal, but Hastings knew that Blackthorn Manor would never forget the shadow of Miss Finch's betrayal. Poirot, however, was already looking ahead, his mind no doubt turning to the next puzzle, the next challenge for his little gray cells. The clock struck noon, its chimes fading into the mist as Poirot and Hastings drove away, leaving Blackthorn Manor to its quiet recovery. The case was closed, but the echoes of truth would linger, a testament to the power of observation, logic, and the relentless pursuit of justice. Chapter 12. The Unseen Motive. The late afternoon light filtered through the library windows of Blackthorn Manor, casting a soft glow over the rows of leather-bound books. Hercule Poirot, seated at a polished oak table, reviewed his notes with meticulous care, his silver-tipped cane resting against his chair. Captain Arthur Hastings, standing by the fireplace, watched his friend with a mix of admiration and curiosity. Though Miss Diana Finch's arrest had seemed to close the case, Poirot's restless demeanor suggested there was more to uncover. The air in the manor remained heavy, as if the walls themselves held secrets yet to be revealed. "Hastings, mon ami," Poirot said, his voice low and thoughtful. "The case, it appears resolved, yet the little gray cells, they are not satisfied. There is a shadow behind Mademoiselle Finch's actions, a motive deeper than mere financial loss. We must look beyond the surface." Hastings frowned, his notebook open to a fresh page. "But Poirot, you proved it was her. The letter, the shovel, the typewriter ribbon. What more could there be?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "The why, Hastings. Greed is a powerful force, oui. But Mademoiselle Finch, she is a woman of control, of calculation. To risk everything for money alone. No, there is something personal, something hidden. We must dig deeper." Poirot requested a private meeting with Lady Beatrice Langley, who joined them in the library, her silver hair immaculate despite the strain in her eyes. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice steady but weary. "Madam, I seek only to understand the full truth. Mademoiselle Finch, she acted out of fear for her financial ruin. What you want? Please let this be." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Here is the truth, Hastings. Mademoiselle Finch lent Rupert money, but she also harbored feelings for him. His rejection, combined with Lady Langley's announcement,
pushed her to desperation. They returned to the library where Poirot shared his findings with Hargrove, who was visibly shaken. "Good Lord, Poirot," he said. "You're saying this was a crime of passion as much as greed?" "Précisément," Poirot replied. "The human heart, it weaves a complex web. Mademoiselle Finch killed to protect her future and to punish a man who spurned her." Hargrove nodded, scribbling in his notebook. "I'll add this to her charges. It strengthens the case." As evening fell, the guests gathered for dinner, their faces reflecting a mix of relief and sorrow. Clara sat quietly, her grief tempered by the knowledge of Rupert's betrayal. Dr. Everett and Evelyn spoke in low tones, their bond strengthened by the ordeal. Colonel Blake's bluster had returned, though tempered by respect for Poirot. The Warwicks, no longer under suspicion, relaxed slightly, their hands clasped. Lady Langley presided with her usual grace, though her eyes betrayed the weight of her companion's betrayal. After dinner, Poirot and Hastings walked the grounds, the cool night air a balm after the Manor's stifling tension. "Poirot," Hastings said, "you saw what no one else did. But how do you bear it, knowing the darkness in people's hearts?" Poirot paused, his cane tapping the gravel path. "It is a burden, mon ami, but also a duty. To see the truth, to bring order to chaos. This is the work of Hercule Poirot. The darkness, it exists, but so does the light. We must seek it, always." The clock struck 9, its chimes echoing across the estate. The Manor stood silent behind them, its secrets laid bare. Poirot adjusted his hat, his expression serene. "Come, Hastings. Tomorrow we return to London. But tonight, let us enjoy the peace of a case well solved." Hastings smiled, falling into step beside his friend. The unseen motive had been revealed, and Blackthorn Manor could begin to heal, its shadows dispelled by the relentless light of Poirot's little gray cells. Chapter 13. The Lingering Doubt. The morning sun broke through the persistent mist at Blackthorn Manor, casting a tentative light over the estate's sprawling gardens. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and fading roses, but the manor itself remained cloaked in a quiet unease. Hercule Poirot, seated in the drawing room with a steaming cup of chocolate.
Miss Finch's confession ties up the loose ends, her motive, the letter, the shovel. Yet you seem restless. Is there something we've missed?
Poirot set down his cup, his fingers steepled beneath his chin.
Mon ami, you are perceptive. The case, it is solved, oui. Mademoiselle Finch killed Monsieur Rupert Langley, driven by greed and a wounded heart. But the little grey cells, they whisper of a shadow, a detail not fully explained. There is one question that lingers. Who was the man Mademoiselle Evelyn saw arguing with Rupert in the garden?
Hastings frowned, flipping through his notebook. Evelyn said it was a tall man in a coat, but we ruled out Warwick and Colonel Blake based on their alibis. Could she have been mistaken? Poirot's eyes gleamed. Mistaken? Perhaps, but not entirely. Her account was specific. A tall man, near the Rose Arbor, at 10:30. Mademoiselle Finch? She is not tall, and her movements place her in the corridor at 10:45. The argument Evelyn witnessed, it was real, but it was not with Finch. There is another player in this drama, Hastings, one who has remained in the shadows. Poirot rose, his cane tapping lightly as he paced. We must revisit the timeline and the clues. The letter, the shovel, the cufflink, these were Finch's work, oui, but the argument suggests a second motive, a second connection to Rupert's death. We must speak with Mademoiselle Evelyn again. They found Evelyn in the library, her auburn curls framing a face still pale with the strain of the past days. She looked up from a book, her eyes wary. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, closing the volume, "is something wrong? I thought the case was closed." Poirot's smile was reassuring but firm. "Mademoiselle Evelyn, you have been most helpful, but I must ask you to recall once more the figure you saw in the garden. You said it was a man, tall, in a coat. Can you describe anything else? His posture, his voice, anything?" Evelyn bit her lip, her hands twisting in her lap. "It was dark and I was at the library window, but he moved with purpose, not like Rupert's restless pacing. His voice was low, angry, but I couldn't make out the words. I'm sure it wasn't Mr. Warwick, he's too slight, or Colonel Blake, who's broader. It was someone else." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And you are certain this was at 10:30? "Yes," she said firmly. "I checked my watch when I left the library at 11. Poirot thanked her and led Hastings to the terrace, where they could speak privately. "The man in the garden," Poirot said.
By 10, wasn't he? Poirot's mustache twitched. "So he claims, mon ami. But alibis, they can be flexible. We must test this. I wish to examine the doctor's room." With Lady Langley's permission, Poirot and Hastings searched Dr. Malcolm Everett's quarters, a comfortable room overlooking the gardens. The search yielded little at first. A medical bag, a few books, a neatly pressed coat. But in a drawer, tucked beneath a stack of papers, Poirot found a small vial of sedative, half empty, and a scrap of paper with a scrawled note. "Rupert, 10:30, Arbor. We must talk." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Voila, Hastings. The doctor, he was not in his room. He met Rupert in the garden, and this vial, it suggests a plan, perhaps to subdue him before Finch's act." They confronted Dr. Everett in the parlor, where he sat with a glass of sherry, his kindly face lined with fatigue. "Monsieur le Docteur," Poirot said, his tone deceptively mild. "You told us you were in your room by 10, yet this note places you in the garden at 10:30, arguing with Rupert. Why did you lie?" Everett's hand trembled, the sherry sloshing slightly. I didn't want to complicate things. Yes, I met Rupert that night. He was frantic about his debts, begging for my help. I refused. I had no money to lend. We argued, but I left him alive, I swear." "And this sedative?" Poirot held up the vial. "Was it meant for Rupert?" Everett's face paled. "No, it's for my own use, for sleepless nights. I had nothing to do with his death." Poirot's gaze was unrelenting. "Yet you concealed this meeting, monsieur. You argued with Rupert, and minutes later he was dead. Did you know Mademoiselle Finch was watching, waiting for her moment?" Everett's shoulders slumped, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't know. I suspected Diana was involved with him, more than she admitted, but I never thought she'd kill him." Poirot nodded, turning to Hastings. "The doctor, he is not the killer, but his silence protected Mademoiselle Finch, perhaps unwittingly. His argument with Rupert set the stage, drawing him to the garden where Finch could act." They reported their findings to Inspector Hargrove, who added the note to the evidence against Miss Finch, strengthening the case. "You've done it again, Poirot," Hargrove said, grudging admiration in his tone. "But why didn't Everett speak up?" Poirot's expression was somber. "Fear, Inspector. Fear of suspicion, of scandal. The human heart, it guards its secrets, even at great cost." As evening fell, the guests gathered for a quiet dinner, their faces reflecting a mix of relief and unease. Dr. Everett sat apart, his head bowed, while Clara and Evelyn spoke softly, their bond strengthened by shared grief.
Thanks to Poirot. On the terrace after dinner, Poirot lit a rare cigarette, the the smoke curling into the night air. "The doubt is resolved, Hastings," he said. The doctor's silence was the final piece. Mademoiselle Finch acted alone, but the web of secrets, love, jealousy, debt, nearly hid her crime. Hastings nodded, his heart heavy. "It's a grim business, Poirot. So many lives torn apart." Poirot's eyes softened. "Oui, mon ami. But the truth, it heals as well as wounds. We have done our part." The clock struck 9, its chimes fading into the night. Blackthorn Manor stood silent, its secrets laid bare, and Poirot, ever the sentinel of justice, prepared to depart, his work complete. Chapter 14. The Final Threads. The early evening light bathed Blackthorn Manor in a soft golden hue, the last rays of the setting sun filtering through the ancient oaks that lined the estate. Inside, the atmosphere was one of quiet resolution, the guests moving with a cautious relief as the weight of Rupert Langley's murder began to lift. Hercule Poirot, seated in the drawing-room with a glass of cognac, his silver-tipped cane resting against his chair, exuded an air of serene satisfaction, though his green eyes remained sharp, ever watchful. Captain Arthur Hastings, standing by the mantelpiece, reviewed his notebook, the pages a testament to the intricate puzzle Poirot had unraveled. Yet a faint unease lingered in Hastings' mind, as though one final thread of the mystery remained untied. "Poirot," Hastings said, closing his notebook, "you've solved the case, exposed Miss Finch, and even uncovered Dr. Everett's hidden meeting with Rupert. But I can't shake the feeling there's something more, some small detail we've overlooked." Poirot sipped his cognac, his mustache twitching slightly. "Mon ami, your instincts, they improve with time. The case is closed, oui, but the little gray cells, they murmur of a final clarification. There is one detail, the telephone call Rupert made at 9:15. We know it concerned his debts, but to whom did he speak? This, Hastings, may illuminate the shadows that remain." Poirot requested the Manor's telephone records once more, this time focusing on the London number Rupert had called. With Inspector Hargrove's assistance, they traced it to a small office in the city, registered to a Mr. Victor Hammond, a known moneylender with a reputation for ruthless dealings. Hargrove, his mustache bristling with renewed interest, confirmed that Hammond was under investigation for extortion. "Could he be involved, Poirot?" the inspector asked. Another met with Clara Langley in the parlor, where she sat, her violet eyes weary but resolute. "Madame Clara," Poirot said gently, "the telephone call your husband made at 9:15, arguing about money owed. Did he ever mention a man named Victor Hammond?" Clara's hands tightened on her shawl, her face paling. Yes, he did. A few weeks ago, Rupert was furious about a letter from a man named Hammond. He said it was a debt he couldn't pay. Not yet. I begged him to tell me more, but he refused. Said he'd handle it." Poirot nodded, his eyes gleaming. "Merci, madame. This confirms the picture. Monsieur Hammond's pressure drove Rupert to desperation, leading him to confide in Mademoiselle Finch, whose own motives turned deadly." Next, Poirot spoke with Dr. Everett, who sat in the library, his kindly face etched with guilt. "Monsieur le Docteur," Poirot said, "you argued with Rupert in the garden at 10:30, refusing to help with his debts. Did he mention Victor Hammond?" Everett sighed, his shoulders sagging. "He did."
He said Hammond was threatening to ruin him, to expose his debts to Lady Langley. I told him I couldn't help. He needed to face his aunt. I had no idea it would lead to this. Poirot's gaze was piercing. And you did not think to tell us this before? Everett looked away, his voice low. I was ashamed. I thought my silence protected Rupert's memory. I was wrong. Poirot dismissed him gently, turning to Hastings. The final thread, mon ami. Hammond's call pushed Rupert to the edge, prompting his meeting with Everett and his vulnerability to Finch's trap. She used his despair, his rejection of her affections, to lure him to the boathouse. They shared their findings with Hargrove, who noted the connection to Hammond for further investigation. This doesn't change Finch's guilt, he said, but it explains why Rupert was so on edge that night. Poirot nodded. Précisément. The crime, it is not one act, but a chain of choices. Hammond's greed, Everett's refusal, Finch's betrayal. Each played a part, but only one pulled the trigger. As night fell, the guests gathered for a final dinner, their faces reflecting a fragile peace. Lady Beatrice Langley, presiding with quiet dignity, thanked Poirot formally. You have restored order to our home, Monsieur Poirot, she said. The trust for the estate will proceed. Days. Poirot, Hastings said. You tied it all together. Hammond, Everett, Finch. But how do you always see what others miss? Poirot's smile was wistful. It is not magic, mon ami. It is method, order, and method, applied to the chaos of human nature. The clues, they are there, in the glances, the silences, the misplaced objects. One must only listen to the little gray sails. Hastings chuckled. You make it sound simple, but I know better. Poirot adjusted his hat, his cane tapping the stone. Simple, no, but necessary. The world, it is full of shadows, but we bring the light. Now, Hastings, let us prepare for our departure. London calls, and I have a craving for a proper brioche. As they walked toward the manor, the clock struck 10. Its chimes a gentle farewell to the case. Blackthorn Manor stood resilient, its wounds beginning to heal. And Poirot, ever the guardian of truth, left behind a legacy of clarity in a house once clouded by deception. Chapter 15. The Departure. The morning of departure dawned clear over Blackthorn Manor, the October sun casting a golden sheen across the Kentish hills, as though nature itself sought to wash away the shadows of the past days. The manor, with its ivy-clad walls and ancient oaks, stood serene, its wounds beginning to mend in the wake of Hercule Poirot's revelations. Inside, the air was lighter, though tinged with the bittersweet ache of loss and resolution. Poirot, impeccably dressed in his black suit, his mustache waxed to perfection, stood in the entrance hall, his silver-tipped cane in hand, preparing to leave. Captain Arthur Hastings, his faithful companion, adjusted his hat, his suitcase at his feet, his notebook tucked safely in his coat pocket, a chronicle of the case that had unfolded with such dramatic precision. Poirot, Hastings said, glancing around the hall,
where the portraits of Langley ancestors seemed to watch their departure. You've done it again. You've brought light to this place. But I can't help feeling a pang for them all. Clara, Lady Langley, even Dr. Everett. They'll carry this for years. Poirot's green eyes softened, a rare glimpse of the man beneath the detective. Mon ami, it is the way of things. The truth, it cuts, but it also heals. Blackthorn Manor will endure. Blackthorn into a brighter future. Clara Langley, her violet eyes still shadowed but resolute, stepped forward, clutching a small bouquet of roses from the manor's garden. Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. These are for you. Rupert loved these roses, and I want you to have them. As a thank you, I can move forward now knowing the truth. Hastings accepted the bouquet, his throat tight. Thank you, Mrs. Langley. We wish you peace. Dr. Malcolm Everett, his kindly face lined with remorse, shook Poirot's hand. I was a fool to stay silent, Poirot. Your clarity has taught me a lesson I won't forget. Evelyn Carter, her auburn curls bouncing with a hint of her former vivacity, smiled faintly. You're a marvel, Monsieur Poirot. I'll never look at a garden the same way again. Colonel Reginald Blake, his mustache bristling, offered a gruff nod. Damned fine work, sir. Never thought I'd see a case solved with such finesse. Gerald and Margaret Warwick, their nerves eased, murmured their thanks, their hands clasped tightly. We're grateful, Monsieur Poirot, Gerald said, adjusting his spectacles. You cleared the suspicion from us all. Poirot's smile was gracious but enigmatic. Mes amis, the truth is a light that shines on all, guilty and innocent alike. I am glad to have served you. Inspector Hargrove, lingering by the door, approached last, his mustache twitching with reluctant admiration. Poirot, I'll admit I doubted you, but you've got a mind like a steel trap. That business with Hammond and Finch, it's airtight. We'll see she faces justice. Poirot inclined his head. Merci, Inspector. Justice. It is the foundation of order. I trust you will pursue Monsieur Hammond's role in this affair with equal vigor. As the guests dispersed, Poirot and Hastings stepped onto the gravel drive, where a car waited to take them to the station. The manor loomed behind them, its windows glinting like eyes bidding farewell. Hastings glanced back, the bouquet in his hand a poignant reminder of the lives touched by their work. Poirot, he said, do you ever wonder what happens after we leave? How they pick up the pieces? Poirot paused, his cane tapping the ground. Always, Hastings. But we are not the architects of their futures, only the revealers of their truths. We give them the tools to rebuild, and that is enough. The car rolled down the drive, the manor shrinking in the distance. Poirot leaned back, his eyes half closed, his mind already turning to new horizons. London awaits more cells. They demand exercise. And you, my friend, you are the perfect companion for the chase. As the car reached the village, the church clock struck 11, its chimes a final echo of their time at Blackthorn. The case was closed, the killer unmasked, and the manor's secrets laid bare. Yet Hastings knew that wherever Poirot went, another mystery would follow, drawn to the man whose mind could unravel the darkest of human hearts. They boarded the train to London, the countryside rolling past in a blur of green and gold. Poirot adjusted his hat, his expression one of quiet contentment. To order and method, Hastings, he said, raising an imaginary glass, and to the truth which never fails us. Hastings smiled, settling back in his seat. To truth, he echoed, the roses in his lap a silent tribute to the justice they had served. Blackthorn Manor faded into memory, but the legacy of Poirot's brilliance would endure, a beacon in the fog of human deceit.